Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and we have been doing this series on evangelicalism, what happened. And today we're going to look at part 3, and I would encourage you to watch part 1 and part 2 of this series to kind of build up to this point, and thereby you can get a better understanding how this particular series, the lessons, how they build upon one another. So we're going to deal with part 3 today, which has to do with contemporary evangelicalism and the public square. Contemporary evangelicalism and the public square. So let's get right into this. Let's see what research brings to mind here as we are learning about evangelicalism. Let's start out with a quote. And this quote is by Calvin P. Van Recken. And he states, "No doubt individual Christians have their opinions, but I believe that it is taking the Lord's name in vain to claim divine status for your political judgment." Think about that. When we begin to talk about evangelicalism in the public marketplace, we're looking here at an evolution from its original Christian and philosophical positions. Basically, what it had, how they originally believed in regards to public engagement, how they believed in regards to politics, and how they believed that faith and politics, how they were to approach politics. Let me put it that way. And we're going to get into that. The presidential election of 1980 saw 3 born-again evangelical candidates. All of them ran for office. The incumbent, Jimmy Carter, a lifelong Southern Baptist and longtime Sunday school teacher. Carter's Republican challenger and eventual winner, Ronald Reagan. And John Anderson, an evangelical Republican Congress member who ran as an independent. During the campaign that year, the Christian right, at that time called the New Religious Right, burst onto the political scene led by Jerry Falwell and his organization called the Moral Majority. In 2 decades, between 1980 and 2000, the Christian right succeeded in pushing religion onto the center stage in American politics. This was a remarkable feat when one considers that before 1976, when Jimmy Carter ran for the first time openly as an evangelical, there was a common rule of decorum that said, one should not mix religion with politics. One should not mix religion with politics. And this is part of that original Christian and philosophical position that evangelicals had from the very beginning. So let's delve into it a little bit further, because we're talking about contemporary evangelicalism and how they relate to the public marketplace, specifically in regards to politics. Before we can begin to understand the contemporary positions that evangelicals have taken, we need to define 2 secular terms in the political marketplace. As we have learned thus far, politics and religion did not mix for evangelicals in their formative stages, which was due to their core theological positions. However, the exclusion of politics from their evangelical praxis morphed. But why? And in what forms? We will discuss in this segment how this syncretism formed between evangelicalism and political conservatives, and let me say this, specifically right-wing evangelicals, or the conservative right, or the religious right evangelicals and political conservatives, how they began to form this alliance with the Republican Party. And we're going to look at how all of this came about, how all of this began to take place, so we can have a better understanding as to why we see the behavior that we see today and what's the background. A lot of times, as we said the last time, most people, Christians, do not know why they believe what they believe. And that goes specifically also to even evangelicals, that many of them just kind of adopt what has been traditionally passed on to them or that has been purported in their particular religious assemblies and not ever question as to what's the origin of this way of thinking without just taking things hook, line, and sinker. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at the liberal evangelicals. We're going to look at who they are. We're going to look at their agenda and their leanings toward the Democratic Party. So here are the two words that I want to unpack right now. And one's called political liberalism, and the other one's called political conservatism. Now, these words can be looked up. You can go to Britannica, and you can see where I got these from, or you can also go to Wikipedia, for some more what I would call popular or easy to read, accessible type research engines. Here's what it says. Liberalism is a political doctrine that takes protecting and enhancing individual freedom to be the central problem of politics. Liberals typically believe that government is necessary to protect individuals from being harmed by others, but they also recognize that government itself can pose a threat to liberty. Conservatism, on the other hand, is a political doctrine that emphasizes the value of traditional institutions and practices. The central tenets of conservatism include tradition, hierarchy, and authority as established in respective cultures, as well as property rights. So we can see the basic difference between these two political philosophies is the following. Liberalism is more focused on protecting and enhancing individual freedom, whereas conservatism is more focused on values, the value, traditional institutions, and practices. So one is focused on the individual, the other one is focused on institutions. Now, there are more elaborate definitions available, but for the sake of brevity, I think these seem to be appropriate. Political liberalism and the role of the public religion. Why religion and politics don't mix. Now, here we need to go back to a gentleman by the name of John Boardley Rawls. He was born in 1921, passed away in 2004. And he was an American moral and political philosopher in the liberal tradition. And he was basically situated among, again, political liberals. But let me point this out. To the political liberal, religion was a private matter and should not play a role in the public square. To the political liberal, this is how it was in the beginning, religion was a private matter and should not play a role in the public square. John Rawls, the chief theorist of this view, along with those devoted to political liberalism, they saw themselves as embodying the liberal tradition of the 17th century philosopher John Locke. The modern form of political liberalism holds that in a pluralistic democracy, such as ours, it is uncivil and unfair to bring what Rawls called comprehensive doctrines into matters of law and politics. Now, a comprehensive doctrine is any worldview that seeks to say what is good, what is right, and what is just. And guess what? Religious beliefs fit into that category. The view that religion is private helps explain why for so long in American politics there existed this general rule of decorum that religion and politics don't mix. It was considered bad manners at the least and uncivil at the worst to probe a candidate's personal religious views during a political campaign. Clearly, this is not the case today. Well, let's talk about the old religious right. In my opinion, based upon what I've studied, they were an exception to the rule. The old religious right were an exception to the rule regarding involvement in politics. Now, their initiative began in the 1930s and lasted into the 1970s. This group consisted of fundamentalists who rejected liberal theory and the spiritualization of the church in order to engage in selected political causes, specifically anti-communism during the Cold War era. So they basically departed from their faith. They basically left their position. They moved away from this liberal theory of where the two don't mix, and the spiritualization of the church, where the church is only to be a spiritual religious body, and they jumped into politics, which was secular, which was worldly, for a few political causes. One of those happened to be anti-communism during the Cold War era. Now, some of these names that I'm going to point out here, you probably have heard about. But I would encourage you, go do the research about some of these individuals that had an impact in the old religious right. Carl McIntyre and Billy James Harris were key figures of the old religious right who used to preach a combination of fundamentalist religion, American patriotism, and anti-communism. The truth is, the old religious right leaders were given to conspiracy theories about communist infiltration and clandestine plots to destabilize America. Now, one of the more outlandish conspiracies that the old religious right postured was a belief, or when I say the old religious right, I'm speaking specifically of these two leaders. And some of the things that they became associated with, kind of bled right into the whole religious right paradigm as a way of thinking. So one of the outlandish conspiracies was the belief that fluoridation of water supplies, which was done with the intent to protect children from tooth decay. Guess what? They thought it was part of a communist plot to deny individual choice and to force government control onto the American people. Now think about this. Most toothpaste today, whether you're buying Crest, Colgate, or whatever other brand that you buy, have fluoride in it. And that's to protect not just children, but it's to protect individuals from tooth decay. Well, they thought they were putting out these conspiracies that the fluoridation of water supplies were done with the intent as part of some plot of the communist plot to deny individual choice and the forced government control on the American people. And if we kind of listen to some of the rhetoric we hear today, even amongst the the religious right or the Christian right today, or evangelicals that are on the right, you'll hear some of these things, that individual choice, and that, that plots are being, that, one party is more aligned with Marxism and more aligned with communism and the like. And that's kind of the vomit that's being spewed out there. And there are people that are within the purviews of the listening audience that buy into that. And a lot of that stuff is outlandish. It's really outlandish. And my hope today is to really unpack some of the truths associated with this, and I'll let you make your own decision. Mine is not to sway you to the right or to the left. I'm just simply a messenger. I'm telling you the truth based upon facts that I've discovered. You make your decision about how you want to believe. The old religious right at that time was part of what has been called lunatic fringe and radical right. They were part of what's been called lunatic fringe and radical right. We have a tendency, even in the Christian faith, to consider, those who are outside our faith group, that are part of some extreme group. We may call them lunatic. Yet at the same time, we, in our own history as evangelicals, have had our own lunatic fringe, and were considered at one time part of the radical right, especially as related to American politics. Well, now let's talk about the new religious right. How did this happen? The new religious right, now commonly referred to as the Christian right. The reason this group entered mainstream politics during the 1960s and 70s, there was significant movements to resist sex education in schools. Conservative Christians were convinced that sex education was an effort by the government to indoctrinate their children with anti-Christian morality. Additionally, during 1962 and 63, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that organized prayer in public school was an unconstitutional establishment of religion. Combining the prayer decisions and the advent of sex education, Christian conservatives coined the statement, "The government has taken God out of schools and put sex in its place." In his study of the rise of the Christian right, sociologist William Martin concluded that sex education controversies taught Christian conservatives an important lesson. They learned, quote unquote, that by marshaling their arguments, organizing their forces, and stomping on the hottest buttons, they could exert influence out of all proportion to their numbers or the true popularity of their opinion. As a side note here, this is mostly looking at the Christian right or the conservatives during the 60s at that period of time. Guess what? The evangelical left, which we'll talk about a little bit later, their focus was on anti-war, and they were also advocates of civil rights. So we see that the evangelical left was philosophically had different philosophical opinions about the direction of politics of the nation. They were against the war in Vietnam, and they were advocates of civil rights. Whereas the Christian right, they were focused upon prayer in schools. It was focused on sex education and those kinds of things. So you can see that their emphasis and their motives were very different even back in the 60s. And that helps us to understand why there's a disconnect between the evangelical right and the evangelical left, even in our current public marketplace. So let's look a bit further here. As we continue to talk about the new religious rights, I think this is a time that we need to introduce the term strange bedfellows. There are so many developments in the evangelical world since the 1970s. However, when it came to politics, the first major political show of strength was the influence of the moral majority in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. Jerry Falwell was the leader of that movement. And in 1980, and probably for the next 10 years, Falwell's moral majority gained a substantial amount of media attention among the new religious right groups. By 1990, the moral majority was defunct, and Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition would become the most visible religious right group. The name eventually was changed to the Christian Right. Now, let me say this before I go on to talk about Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson's differences. One of the things, the very weapon and disseminator of information, just like it was during the old religious right, they used the radio. In the new religious right, they used the television. And so now this emergence of all these Christian TV programs, and the ones that could put their program on the air, the ones that could afford to do it, guess what? Their message was heard more. And so we find that, shows like the 700 Club, and we shows and programs that were related to Jerry Falwell and others, we find that because they could afford to be on the air, they had a greater opportunity of getting their message out to Christians and that voice being heard. In fact, when you thought of Christian TV, subconsciously most Christians thought, oh, I'm watching Christian TV. But what you were watching was the conservative rights version of Christian TV. Now, I know that's a wake-up call for many of you that are watching right now. When we were back in the 70s watching Christian TV, we thought that was the best thing as good as sliced bread. And he said, wow, we can watch a 700 Club, we can watch PTL, we can watch all of these things. What we don't know, that the individuals that were in charge of those programs, was paying for that airtime, were from the what? They were from the conservative right. So their agenda, their beliefs, and their views got spewed out into the Christian marketplace, into Christian churches and communities. And so thereby, most Christians became discipled by the what? Christians in America that watched Christian TV became discipled by the religious right or the conservative Christian agenda. Now that's a fact, and that's true. Had it been the other way around, it would be a different story in the evangelical world right now under the name of Jesus. So Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson had some diverse differences. Basically, theologically, Falwell was a Southern Baptist, but guess what? Robertson early on, he was a Southern Baptist too, but he became charismatic. And you'll find a lot of charismatic beliefs that are aligned, because of the influence of Pat Robertson, because of the influence of PTL, because of the influence of the 700 Club. Those who, they kind of endorse the charismatic. They kind of endorse the Pentecostal and the display of the gifts of the Spirit and so on and so forth. So most Pentecostals and charismatics, because their favorite doctrine and promoter of their worldview was a Christian right, was a conservative right. We didn't think about that they were conservative right. We thought about the fact that they believe like we believe, and so therefore we support them because they're talking our language. We have become formulated by a conservative right point of view through the use of media. Now, I'm not saying all this just so that, I'm attacking, that I'm attacking the religious right and so on and so forth. I'm not doing that at all. Because let me tell you something. I'm speaking as an insider. I was one of these individuals. I was one of these that sat there at the Christian TV and that believed like I was taught, and I voted according to my religious beliefs, and those who matched my religious belief, they got my vote. Until I matured and became more wise and discerning about what's in the best interest of all people. So yes, I'm talking as an insider, not talking against it, but I'm just showing you how things became the way they are. And one of the most powerful tools that has been in the conservative evangelical camp has been the use of Christian television. So regardless of the differences, this is what we know. The major tenets of the Christian right platform and its syncretism with the Republican Party has centered around abortion, same-sex marriage, prayer in school, and as of late, immigration, to say the least. Let me make this point. And there's probably other issues that fall along that agenda. But let me make this point. It is well known that any Republican candidate that is running for the presidency must appeal to that Christian right voting bloc by making promises to support their cause. Well, now we see the name has changed from the New Religious Right, and they kind of dropped that and they became the Christian right. Time would fail me to talk about all of the Christian right groups, because let me tell you, there's a lot of them out there. And all of those Christian right groups that are aligned with the Republican Party, again, there's a lot of them out there. However, one significant group was focused on the family under the leadership of James Dobson. His first foray into politics was his founding of the Family Research Council lobby group. Now, he did this in 1983. Then in 2004, Dobson established Focus on the Family Action, which is not tax exempt and can be an active participant in partisan politics. And some of you ministry leaders out there know that if you have a 501c3, you cannot use your pulpit, you cannot use you cannot use that platform to endorse a particular candidate, or to get out there and be active in partisan politics of your choice. You can't do it, because otherwise you put your 501c3 in jeopardy. However, Dobson understood this, and he was smart enough to form something that was not tax exempt, that could focus and be part of the partisan politics. So he established what's called Focus on the Family Action. He was instrumental in the founding of the quote unquote I Vote Values campaign. And you remember that? You remember that being around? I Vote Values campaign. That came out. That was sponsored by James Dobson, and that's part of the Christian Right Initiative. And guess what? The Christian and those I Vote Values campaign, that Christian Right effort helped secure George W. Bush's reelection as president. Now that's a fact. Some estimate that between 7 to 9 million new evangelical voters attended the polls in this election, presumably to vote for George W. Bush. Go check it out. Don't take my word for it. Well, let's talk about the evangelical left. Same moon, different side. The moon being the evangelicals, but on one side is left, on the other side is right, philosophically, and they are different in terms of how they approach politics. Now let's break into it. There are other evangelicals that have skin in this game when it comes to influencing the public square. One of those groups is referred to as the evangelical left. The evangelical left theologically affirm the primary beliefs of all evangelicals, such as what? Incarnation, atonement, resurrection, and they regard the Bible as being the authority of the church. One of the basic differences theologically are that the evangelical left was their openness to progressive interpretation of Christian beliefs. However, politically, they are opposed to capital punishment. They support gun control and welfare programs. Now watch this. So when we hear capital punishment, the opposition against it, and when we hear gun control and welfare programs today, the first thing that you hear, that's a liberal agenda. It's being assigned to the liberals. But guess what? The evangelical left, in many cases, favor that particular side. The conservative right favor all the other things of the other side. Now, it's important to understand this. Let me mention this. In his 2014 book, Moral Minority, the evangelical left in an age of conservatism, politics, and culture in modern America, David R. Schwartz argues that during the 60s and 70s, the evangelical left stood for anti-war, we talked about that earlier, civil rights, anti-consumer principles while supporting doctrinal and also sexual fidelity. Schwartz documents the activities of large organizations of the evangelical left, and he includes Sojourners. We know that Sojourners is headed up by Jim Wallace and still pretty active today. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Evangelicals for Social Action, and Association for Public Justice. He also explains how the evangelical left helped influence the broader evangelical movement by helping to elect the first born-again U.S. president, Jimmy Carter. Now, most of us didn't know that all this stuff was going on behind the scenes from an evangelical left perspective, but it was. And so it also, the evangelical left also showed in their effort to get this first born-again president out there, they showed the evangelical right how to politically organize. This is factual. Well, now, as we wrap this up today, I trust that you've been informed. Again, my point is, as a messenger, is just simply putting the stuff out there. My point here is to get you to think. Don't just take what somebody says, but really think about it. Go do your own research. Don't just sit there and just take in what either side says, hook, line, and sinker, without knowing why they believe what they believe. So here are 5 points that I want to leave with you today. Number one, all evangelicals share the same core theological beliefs. Number two, in their formative years, they were opposed to mixing politics with religion. But over the last 5 decades, there's been a growing evangelical presence in the political marketplace. Number three, the Christian right is situated with the Republican Party and has had a formidable influence in the political marketplace since the election of Ronald Reagan. Number four, the evangelical left leans more to the Democratic Party or the liberal agenda on some issues and was credited for their influence in electing Jimmy Carter and modeling before the Christian right on how to politically organize. Number five, what must be remembered is that the ideological and the philosophical battle here has been between secular politics and not Christian beliefs. Let me say it again. The ideological and philosophical battle here, that is between what? We're looking at between Republicans and Democrats. That's really what the battle is all about. And most don't know that. They think, this is the Christian value. No, this is an alignment toward one party. The other is an alignment toward the other party. So the ideological and philosophical battle has been between secular politics and not Christian beliefs. This is the line that is drawn in the sand. Left and right. Left and right. Conservative, liberal. Democrat, Republican. That's the line that's drawn in the sand. And I want to say this. And in many cases, evangelicals who are in pursuit of political power have forgotten who they truly represent in this world. Well, I trust that this has been informative, enlightening, especially in light of what's the season that we're in, the time of it happens every 4 years. But I think that if we consider what we're hearing today, that we'll at least be better informed about our core principles if we identify with being evangelical and know why you believe what you believe on the right and know why you believe what you believe on the left. But remember, in the very beginning, politics and religion did not mix. If you want more information, on this last side, I have bibliographic references for your further reading, and you can take your chance to take the opportunity to write some of this stuff down or watch this again and, take a snapshot of that particular page, and then you can begin to do your own research. God bless you. We'll be with you again next week as we delve into Evangelicalism Part 4. We're going to talk about, evangelicals and the problem of injustice. That's next week. Don't you miss it. We'll see you then.